My name is Sarah Elisabeth Morrison, and 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, my stepfather gathered the entire family in his study to announce that I had been completely removed from her will. Standing behind her mahogany desk with a smug satisfaction I had never seen before, Richard Blackwell held up what he claimed were my mother's final wishes and declared that my rebellious choices and ungrateful attitude had cost me my inheritance. The room fell silent as relatives who had known me since childhood absorbed this supposed betrayal by the woman who had raised me with unconditional love. I felt my world collapse as he explained that my mother's multimillion-dollar estate would be distributed among my stepbrother Marcus, my stepsister Victoria, and various charities, leaving me with nothing but a few pieces of costume jewelry. What Richard did not know, what none of them knew, was that 6 months earlier my mother had secretly established a separate trust with her longtime attorney, one that would not be revealed until exactly 90 days after her death. The day that trust was unsealed, Richard's face went from confident smugness to ashen terror as he realized that not only had my mother left me the majority of her actual estate, but she had also documented every instance of his financial manipulation and emotional abuse in a detailed letter that would expose him to the entire family and potentially to criminal investigation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of that family meeting began like so many others. In the weeks following my mother's sudden passing from a massive stroke, I had been staying at the family estate in Beacon Hill, Boston, helping to sort through decades of accumulated memories while grieving the loss of the most important person in my life. Elisabeth Morrison had been more than a mother to me. She had been my closest confidant, my strongest supporter, and the one person who had never questioned my decision to pursue social work instead of the lucrative corporate career that everyone else expected from someone with my Harvard MBA. The call from Richard requesting my presence at what he termed a family business meeting had struck me as unusual but not alarming. Throughout the 3 weeks since the funeral, he had been handling the estate proceedings with the efficiency that had made him successful in commercial real estate development. Richard had married my mother when I was 15 years old, and, despite our complicated relationship, I had assumed he would execute her final wishes with the same methodical precision he applied to all his business dealings. The Beacon Hill mansion where I had spent my teenage years felt different now without my mother's warm presence filling its elegant rooms. Built in 1847 and meticulously maintained through 5 generations of Morrison family ownership, the house represented old Boston aristocracy at its most refined. Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors, oil paintings of stern ancestors gazed down from silk-covered walls, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves contained first editions that my great-grandfather had collected during his travels through Europe. In the early 1900s, my mother had inherited this house and the substantial Morrison family fortune when she was just 28 years old, after her parents died in a plane crash during a European vacation. She had spent the next 35 years not just preserving that legacy, but significantly expanding it through careful investments and philanthropic work that had earned her respect throughout New England's charitable and social circles. Elisabeth Morrison was known for her intelligence, her compassion, and her unwavering support for causes that helped disadvantaged children and families. Her sudden death at age 63 had shocked everyone who knew her. Just 2 days before her stroke, we had enjoyed lunch together at her favorite restaurant in Cambridge, discussing my plans to expand the youth mentorship program I had been developing for at-risk teenagers in Boston's inner-city neighborhoods. She had been excited about the program's potential impact and had promised to provide both financial support and connections to other philanthropists who might be interested in funding similar initiatives. The irony of Richard's announcement about my supposed disinheritance was particularly painful because it contradicted everything my mother had stood for throughout her life. Elisabeth Morrison had dedicated her career and her wealth to helping young people overcome difficult circumstances and build successful futures despite challenging backgrounds. The idea that she would punish her own daughter for choosing meaningful work over financial gain was completely inconsistent with her values and her character. But as I sat in that mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by relatives I had known since childhood, I watched their faces change from surprise to disappointment as they absorbed Richard's explanation of my mother's alleged decision. My Aunt Margaret, my mother's younger sister who had always been my strongest supporter after my mother herself, looked at me with confusion and hurt. My cousins Jennifer and Thomas, with whom I had shared countless family holidays and celebrations, seemed unable to meet my eyes. Richard's presentation was masterfully manipulative. He had prepared copies of what appeared to be official legal documents that outlined the distribution of my mother's estate. According to these papers, my stepbrother Marcus would inherit 40% of her assets, including her investment portfolio and the commercial properties she had accumulated over the years. My stepsister Victoria would receive 30%, including the family's vacation home in Cape Cod and her collection of antique jewelry. The remaining 30% would be distributed among 3 charitable organizations that my mother had supported throughout her life. The explanation Richard provided for my exclusion was calculated to sound plausible to family members who had not been privy to my private conversations with my mother during her final months. He claimed that my mother had become increasingly disappointed with my career choices and my refusal to consider joining the family's business interests. According to Richard, she had been particularly upset about my decision to turn down a lucrative position with a prestigious consulting firm in order to continue my work with disadvantaged youth. Elisabeth felt that Sarah had rejected everything the family stood for, Richard explained to the assembled relatives, his voice carrying a tone of regretful disappointment. She invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in Sarah's education, expecting that she would use her Harvard degree to build something substantial. Instead, Sarah chose to work with troubled teenagers for a non-profit salary that barely covers her expenses. Elisabeth saw this as a betrayal of the opportunities she had provided. The words cut deeply because they contained just enough truth to be believable. It was accurate that my mother had paid for my undergraduate education at Williams College and my MBA at Harvard Business School. It was also true that I had turned down several high-paying corporate positions to pursue social work that paid significantly less than what my education might have commanded in the private sector. What Richard's narrative omitted was the countless conversations in which my mother had expressed pride in my choices and admiration for my commitment to helping others. She had often told me that she considered my work with at-risk youth to be more valuable than any corporate achievement because it created lasting positive change in individual lives. She had specifically said that she hoped I would use my inheritance to expand my programs and create a foundation that could help troubled young people throughout New England. The legal documents Richard presented appeared authentic and official. They bore the letterhead of Patterson, Wells and Associates, the law firm that had handled my mother's affairs for more than 20 years. The signatures looked genuine, and the language was consistent with formal estate planning documents I had seen before. To family members who were not familiar with the intricacies of estate law, these papers provided convincing evidence that my mother had indeed decided to exclude me from her will. But something about the entire presentation felt wrong to me in ways I could not immediately articulate. My mother had been meticulous about financial planning and legal documentation throughout her life. She had always insisted on discussing major decisions with family members who would be affected by them. The idea that she would make such a dramatic change to her estate plan without ever mentioning it to me seemed completely out of character. More troubling was Richard's demeanor during the presentation. Instead of the somber regret that would be appropriate when delivering disappointing news to a grieving family member, he seemed almost pleased to be announcing my exclusion. There was a subtle smugness in his tone and a satisfaction in his expression that suggested he was enjoying this moment rather than finding it painful or awkward. My stepbrother Marcus and stepsister Victoria, who were also present for the meeting, seemed uncomfortable with the situation in ways that surprised me. Marcus, who was 2 years younger than me and had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship with me, kept glancing nervously between his father and me throughout Richard's presentation. Victoria, who was 5 years younger and had often sought my advice during her college years, appeared confused and upset by the announcement. The family meeting concluded with Richard distributing copies of the legal documents to all the relatives present and explaining that the estate would be settled according to my mother's expressed wishes within the next 60 days. He emphasized that these decisions were final and that any attempts to contest the will would be both expensive and futile, since my mother had been of sound mind when she made these changes and had worked with experienced legal counsel to ensure that her wishes would be honored. As the relatives filed out of the study, offering awkward condolences and avoiding direct eye contact, I remained seated in the leather chair where I had listened to my world collapse. The magnitude of what had just occurred was difficult to process. Not only had I lost my mother, but according to Richard, she had rejected me so completely that she had chosen to leave me nothing despite our apparently close relationship. The financial implications were significant but not immediately devastating. I had been living independently for several years and had not been depending on an inheritance to support myself. My work with youth mentorship programs provided enough income to cover my modest expenses, and I had some savings that would allow me to maintain my lifestyle for the foreseeable future. The emotional impact, however, was crushing. The suggestion that my mother had been disappointed in my choices and had considered my career path a betrayal of her investment in my education contradicted every conversation we had shared about my future. She had consistently expressed pride in my work and had encouraged me to pursue my passion for helping disadvantaged youth rather than seeking more lucrative but less fulfilling opportunities. That evening, alone in the guest room where I had been staying since the funeral, I reviewed every interaction I had shared with my mother during her final months. I searched for signs that she had been harboring resentment about my career choices or disappointment about my life direction. Despite careful consideration, I could not recall a single conversation or incident that would suggest she was reconsidering her support for my decisions. Instead, I remembered her excitement about the mentorship program I was developing and her eagerness to provide both funding and strategic guidance for its expansion. Just 3 weeks before her death, she had introduced me to several potential donors who might be interested in supporting youth development initiatives. She had specifically mentioned her intention to make my program a major beneficiary of her charitable giving for the coming year. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The contradiction between these recent conversations and Richard's announcement was so stark that I began to question whether the documents he had presented were authentic. While I had no expertise in estate law or document authentication, my mother's supposed change of heart seemed psychologically implausible given everything I knew about her character and our relationship. Over the following days, as word of my disinheritance spread through Boston's philanthropic and social circles, I experienced a level of isolation and humiliation that I had never encountered before. People who had known my mother and me for years began treating me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Some seemed to assume that I must have done something terrible to deserve such treatment from my own mother. Others appeared to believe that my career choices had indeed been selfish and ungrateful, justifying my mother's decision to exclude me from her will. The social dynamics were particularly painful because they affected relationships that had been important to me for many years. Colleagues in the nonprofit sector began questioning whether I would be able to continue my work without the family financial support they had assumed I would eventually inherit. Board members of organizations where I volunteered started treating me differently, as though my reduced circumstances made me less valuable as a contributor to their causes. Most difficult was the impact on my relationship with my extended family. Cousins who had been close friends throughout our childhood became distant and awkward in their interactions with me. Aunts and uncles who had always treated me as a beloved niece began limiting their contact, apparently concerned that my situation might be contagious or that my presence would create uncomfortable reminders of family conflict. The isolation was compounded by my own uncertainty about what had actually occurred. While I suspected that Richard's presentation had been misleading or incomplete, I had no concrete evidence to support my suspicions. The legal documents appeared authentic, and my mother was no longer available to clarify her intentions or explain her reasoning. During this period of confusion and isolation, I made the decision that would ultimately lead to the discovery that would change everything. Instead of accepting Richard's version of events or attempting to contest the will through expensive litigation, I decided to conduct my own investigation into the circumstances surrounding my mother's estate planning during her final months. The investigation began with a simple phone call to James Patterson, the senior partner at Patterson, Wells and Associates who had handled my mother's legal affairs for more than 2 decades. Mr. Patterson had known my mother since before her marriage to Richard and had been present at family celebrations and important milestone events throughout my childhood. If anyone could provide insight into my mother's final wishes and the reasoning behind her decisions, it would be the attorney who had worked with her for so many years. The conversation with Mr. Patterson was brief but revealing. When I explained that I was calling to better understand my mother's estate planning decisions, he seemed surprised and confused by my questions. According to Mr. Patterson, he had not worked with my mother on any changes to her will during the months before her death. The most recent update to her estate documents had occurred more than 3 years earlier, and those documents specifically included me as a major beneficiary. This information contradicted everything Richard had told the family during his presentation. If Mr. Patterson had not prepared the documents that Richard had distributed, then either my mother had worked with a different attorney without informing her longtime legal counsel, or the documents themselves were fraudulent. The discovery that my mother's longtime attorney had not been involved in the supposed changes to her will was the first concrete evidence that Richard's version of events might be false. But it was only the beginning of revelations that would ultimately expose the full extent of his deception and reveal the extraordinary measures my mother had taken to protect me and preserve her true wishes. What I did not know at the time of that phone call was that my mother had indeed made significant changes to her estate planning during her final months. But those changes had not involved excluding me from her will. Instead, she had taken steps to ensure that her true wishes would be protected from exactly the kind of manipulation that Richard was attempting to execute. The story of those protective measures, and the stunning revelation that would occur when they were finally activated, would transform my understanding not only of my mother's final months, but of the entire relationship between truth, justice, and the courage required to stand up against those who attempt to abuse their power over others. This transformation would ultimately lead me to discover my own strength and purpose in ways I had never imagined possible, creating a foundation for the most meaningful and rewarding chapter of my life. Understanding how Richard Blackwell managed to orchestrate such an elaborate deception requires examining the foundation he had been systematically undermining for nearly 15 years. The manipulation did not begin with my mother's death or even during her final illness. It started the day Richard married into the Morrison family and recognized that my close relationship with my mother represented the primary obstacle to his complete control over her considerable wealth and social influence. Richard had arrived in my mother's life during one of her most vulnerable periods. She was 48 years old, recently recovered from a difficult divorce from my biological father, and struggling to balance her demanding role as a single mother with her responsibilities as the heir to a significant family fortune. The Morrison estate required constant attention, from managing investment portfolios to overseeing charitable commitments that had been established by previous generations. My biological father, Jonathan Sheffield, had been a brilliant but unstable academic whose gambling addiction and extramarital affairs had ultimately destroyed their marriage when I was 13 years old. The divorce proceedings had been acrimonious and public, generating unwanted attention in Boston's social circles, and leaving my mother emotionally exhausted and financially vulnerable despite her substantial inherited wealth. Richard presented himself as the solution to all these challenges. He was 45 years old, recently widowed, and had built a successful commercial real estate development company that gave him credibility in business circles. More importantly, he possessed the kind of steady, reliable personality that seemed to offer the stability my mother desperately needed after years of chaos with my father. The courtship was methodical and strategic. Richard understood that my mother valued intelligence, social consciousness, and family commitment above material success or physical attraction. He researched her philanthropic interests and began attending charity events where he could demonstrate his commitment to the causes she supported. He learned about the Morrison family history and spoke knowledgeably about the legacy she was working to preserve and expand. Most strategically, Richard recognized that winning my acceptance would be crucial to securing his position in my mother's life. At 15 years old, I was intensely protective of my mother after witnessing the damage my father's behavior had inflicted on our family. Any potential stepfather would need to prove that he could provide the emotional support and stability that my father had failed to deliver. Richard's approach to building a relationship with me was masterful in its calculated authenticity. He attended my soccer games and debate tournaments, showing genuine interest in my academic achievements and extracurricular activities. He offered thoughtful advice about college applications and career planning, positioning himself as the reliable father figure I had been missing since my parents' separation. During the 2 years between his introduction to our family and his marriage to my mother, Richard demonstrated remarkable patience and strategic thinking. He never pushed for decisions or commitments, instead allowing my mother to reach conclusions that felt like her own choices. He integrated himself gradually into our family routines and traditions, making himself indispensable without ever appearing demanding or controlling. The transformation in my mother during this period was remarkable and genuinely positive. The stress and anxiety that had characterized her demeanor throughout my father's gambling and infidelity problems gradually disappeared. She began laughing again, planning for the future with optimism, and engaging with her social and philanthropic commitments with renewed energy and enthusiasm. Richard's influence on our family finances was similarly beneficial during the early years of their relationship. He helped my mother reorganize her investment portfolio, streamline the management of inherited properties, and develop more systematic approaches to her charitable giving. His business expertise proved valuable in protecting and growing the Morrison family wealth while ensuring that philanthropic commitments continued to reflect the values that had guided previous generations. The wedding itself was a celebration that seemed to validate every positive development in my mother's life since her divorce. Held at the family estate with more than 200 guests from Boston's philanthropic and social communities, the ceremony represented not just the union of two people, but the restoration of stability and happiness to the Morrison family legacy. I was genuinely happy for my mother during this period and believed that Richard represented the kind of partner she deserved after enduring so much difficulty with my father. At 17 years old, I was grateful to have a stepfather who treated my mother with respect and consideration, who supported my academic ambitions, and who seemed committed to preserving the family values that had shaped my upbringing. The subtle changes in Richard's behavior began so gradually that they were difficult to recognize as deliberate manipulation rather than natural evolution in family dynamics. The first indication that something was shifting occurred during my senior year of high school, when I was applying to colleges and considering various academic and career paths. Throughout my childhood, my mother had encouraged me to pursue whatever subjects and activities genuinely interested me, emphasizing that the Morrison family fortune provided me with the freedom to choose meaningful work over financially motivated career decisions. She had often spoken about her hope that I would use my education and eventual inheritance to expand the family's philanthropic impact and create positive change in areas that mattered to me personally. Richard began subtly questioning this philosophy during family conversations about my future. He would suggest that someone with my academic abilities and family advantages had responsibilities to maximize both personal achievement and financial returns on educational investments. He introduced concepts about duty to family legacy and the importance of building rather than merely preserving inherited wealth. These conversations were never confrontational or directive. Richard was too sophisticated for such obvious manipulation. Instead, he would raise questions that seemed designed to encourage critical thinking about long-term consequences and strategic planning. He would wonder aloud whether pursuing social work or education or other service-oriented careers represented the most effective use of my potential talents and advantages. The impact of these conversations was cumulative and insidious. While my mother continued to express support for my interests in helping others, I began to sense uncertainty in her responses that had not existed before Richard's arrival in our family. She would still encourage me to pursue meaningful work, but she would also mention the importance of developing practical skills and maintaining financial security. During my freshman year at Williams College, the dynamic shifted more noticeably. Richard began positioning himself as my primary advisor for academic and career planning, suggesting that my mother was too emotionally invested in my choices to provide objective guidance. He would frame his advice as protection for both my mother and me, arguing that he could offer perspective unclouded by maternal emotions or family sentimentality. This positioning was particularly effective because it contained elements of truth. My mother was emotionally invested in my success and happiness, and her advice was influenced by her desire to protect me from the kinds of mistakes she felt she had made in her own life. Richard's business background did provide him with practical knowledge about career development and financial planning that my mother lacked. But Richard's advice consistently directed me away from the service-oriented careers that had always interested me and toward opportunities that would enhance family prestige and financial returns. He would research prestigious internships and fellowship programs, forwarding information about consulting firms and investment banks that recruited from elite colleges. He would arrange informal conversations with successful business leaders who could provide mentorship and networking opportunities. The pressure was never overt, and Richard was careful to frame his guidance as expanding my options rather than limiting them. He would suggest that gaining experience in high-level business environments would provide skills and connections that would make me more effective in whatever philanthropic or service work I eventually chose to pursue. He argued that understanding finance and strategy would enable me to create greater positive impact than I could achieve through direct service alone. During my sophomore year, the manipulation became more sophisticated and targeted. Richard began sharing concerns with my mother about my academic performance and social development that were based on selective interpretation of information rather than outright fabrication. He would mention that my grades were strong but not exceptional by Williams College standards, suggesting that I might need additional motivation or support to reach my full potential. When I chose to spend a summer working at a community center in Boston rather than pursuing the investment banking internship that Richard had arranged for me, he expressed disappointment that seemed focused on my mother's reaction rather than his own preferences. He suggested that my decision demonstrated a lack of appreciation for the opportunities that family connections had made available to me. The conversation that followed that summer was the first time I sensed that Richard's influence over my mother was becoming problematic in ways that extended beyond career guidance. My mother expressed confusion about my priorities and questioned whether I was making decisions based on realistic assessment of my abilities and opportunities rather than idealistic notions about changing the world. This conversation was particularly painful because it represented a fundamental shift in how my mother viewed my character and judgment. Throughout my childhood, she had consistently trusted my decision-making and had expressed pride in my commitment to helping others. The suggestion that my choices reflected naivety or selfishness rather than genuine values was completely contrary to everything she had previously communicated about my character and potential. The shift in my mother's perspective was not dramatic or sudden, but it was consistent and cumulative. Richard had successfully planted seeds of doubt about my maturity and judgment that grew stronger each time I made choices that prioritized meaning over prestige or service over financial gain. By the time I graduated from Williams College and was considering my options for graduate school and career development, my mother's support for my interests in social work had become conditional and uncertain. The dynamic became more complex during my years at Harvard Business School, where I was pursuing an MBA primarily because Richard had convinced my mother that advanced business education would provide me with skills necessary for effective leadership in any field, including nonprofit and philanthropic work. The program itself was valuable and intellectually stimulating, but my motivation for completing it was increasingly disconnected from my actual interests and career goals. Richard used my MBA studies to reinforce his arguments about the importance of practical business skills and strategic thinking for anyone planning to manage inherited wealth or lead charitable organizations. He would cite examples of trust fund beneficiaries who had squandered family fortunes through poor financial decisions or ineffective philanthropy, suggesting that my business education was essential protection against similar mistakes. During this period, Richard also began systematically limiting my private conversations with my mother by inserting himself into family communications and decision-making processes in ways that seemed natural and helpful but had the effect of reducing opportunities for unmediated dialogue between us. He would volunteer to coordinate family plans and schedules, ensuring that most of our interactions occurred in settings where he was present and could influence the conversation. The manipulation was sophisticated enough that I did not recognize it as deliberate until much later. Richard never prevented me from communicating with my mother or explicitly controlled our interactions. Instead, he created circumstances that made independent communication more difficult while positioning himself as a helpful facilitator of family coordination and planning. By the time I completed my MBA and was making decisions about career direction, the foundation of trust and understanding between my mother and me had been subtly but significantly altered. While we continued to love each other deeply and maintained regular contact, our conversations about my future had become filtered through Richard's perspectives and concerns in ways that neither of us fully recognized. The most insidious aspect of Richard's manipulation was that it felt protective and supportive rather than controlling or destructive. He consistently framed his guidance as efforts to help me achieve my full potential and make choices that would enable me to create the greatest positive impact. He never directly criticized my values or interests, instead questioning whether my approaches were strategically sound and practically effective. This sophisticated manipulation created a dynamic where opposing Richard's guidance felt like rejecting reasonable advice rather than resisting controlling behavior. When I chose to pursue social work despite his recommendations for more lucrative career paths, I appeared to be making impulsive emotional decisions rather than standing up against systematic undermining of my relationship with my mother. The foundation that Richard had been constructing over more than a decade was designed to support exactly the kind of deception he would eventually attempt after my mother's death. By gradually positioning himself as the primary advisor for family financial and strategic decisions, by subtly undermining my mother's confidence in my judgment and priorities, and by creating communication patterns that filtered most family interactions through his perspectives, Richard had built the infrastructure necessary to control the narrative about my mother's final wishes and my worthiness as an heir to the Morrison family legacy. What I did not understand during these years was that my mother had begun to recognize the manipulation during her final months and had taken extraordinary steps to protect both me and her true wishes from Richard's control. The measures she implemented would ultimately expose not just his deception about her will, but the entire systematic campaign he had waged against my relationship with her and my place in the Morrison family legacy. The revelation of these protective measures would transform my understanding of both my mother's love for me and my own strength in the face of psychological manipulation that had been far more sophisticated and damaging than I had ever realized. The weeks following the family meeting brought a level of social and emotional isolation that I had never experienced in my privileged life. The announcement of my supposed disinheritance created ripple effects throughout Boston's interconnected philanthropic and social communities that extended far beyond my immediate family relationships. Within days, word had spread through charitable boards, country club dining rooms, and private social gatherings that Elisabeth Morrison had rejected her own daughter so completely that she had removed me entirely from her will. The story that circulated through these circles was more damaging than Richard's original presentation to our family. According to the version that reached my professional colleagues and social acquaintances, my mother had become so disappointed with my career choices and so frustrated with my ingratitude that she had not only disinherited me but had also expressed regret about the educational investments she had made in my development. The narrative suggested that I had betrayed family values and rejected opportunities that most people could only dream of receiving. This version of events was particularly devastating because it attacked not just my financial security, but my reputation and character within the community where I had built my professional identity. Boston's nonprofit sector was relatively small and tightly connected, with many organizations sharing board members, donors, and collaborative relationships. The suggestion that I had been so irresponsible or ungrateful that my own mother had rejected me called into question my judgment, my values, and my suitability for leadership roles in charitable organizations. The practical consequences began almost immediately. Within a week of the family meeting, I received a call from Margaret Whitmore, the executive director of the Children's Foundation where I had been serving on the Program Development Committee for 3 years. Margaret had known my mother well through various philanthropic collaborations and had been instrumental in recruiting me to work with their organization. The conversation was awkward and painful in ways that revealed how quickly professional relationships could shift when personal circumstances changed. Margaret explained that the board had been discussing my continued involvement with the foundation and had decided that it would be appropriate for me to step back from my committee responsibilities while I dealt with family matters. "Sarah, we all know how difficult this must be for you," Margaret said with the kind of careful sympathy that barely concealed relief at having a legitimate reason to distance the organization from my situation. "The board feels that taking some time to focus on your personal circumstances would be beneficial for everyone involved. When you are ready to re-engage with volunteer work, we would certainly welcome a conversation about appropriate opportunities." The subtext was clear. My value to the Children's Foundation had been based not just on my skills and commitment, but on my connection to Morrison family wealth and influence. Without the prospect of future financial contributions or access to my mother's extensive donor network, my continued involvement represented more risk than benefit to the organization. Similar conversations followed with other charitable organizations where I had been volunteering. The New England Youth Mentorship Alliance, where I had been developing innovative programs for at-risk teenagers, suggested that I might want to focus on my career transition rather than continuing with demanding volunteer commitments. The Boston Women's Education Fund, where I had been coordinating scholarship programs, indicated that they were restructuring their volunteer leadership and would not need my continued participation. The rejection was never direct or explicitly connected to my changed financial circumstances, but the pattern was unmistakable. Organizations that had actively recruited my involvement and had praised my contributions were suddenly finding reasons why my continued participation was no longer necessary or appropriate. The impact on my professional life was equally swift and demoralizing. The youth mentorship program I had been developing through a small nonprofit organization called Urban Futures had been designed around the expectation of significant funding that I had believed would come from my mother's estate. The program aimed to provide intensive support for teenagers aging out of the foster care system, helping them develop life skills and educational opportunities that would enable them to avoid homelessness and achieve economic stability. The preliminary budget for the program was substantial but reasonable given the scope of services we planned to provide. Individual mentoring relationships, educational support, job training opportunities, and emergency financial assistance would cost approximately $200,000 annually to serve 50 young people effectively. My mother had expressed enthusiasm about the program and had indicated her intention to provide both startup funding and ongoing support through her charitable foundation. Without that expected funding, the program became financially impossible to implement as designed. The executive director of Urban Futures, David Martinez, was sympathetic to my situation but could not justify maintaining my position when the funding I had promised to secure was no longer available. "Sarah, you know how much we value your work and your vision for this program," David explained during a meeting in his cramped office in Boston's South End. "But we cannot move forward with initiatives that we cannot fund sustainably. Without the Morrison Foundation support, we need to scale back our ambitious plans and focus on programs that we know we can maintain long-term." The conversation forced me to confront the uncomfortable reality that my professional identity had been more dependent on family wealth than I had previously acknowledged. While I had genuine skills and experience in youth development work, my ability to design and implement ambitious programs had been enabled by access to funding sources that were connected to my mother's philanthropic network rather than my own fundraising abilities. The loss of professional opportunities was compounded by changes in personal relationships that proved equally painful and isolating. Friends who had been part of my social circle for years began limiting their contact in ways that suggested they were uncomfortable with my reduced circumstances or concerned about being associated with family scandal. Jennifer Ashworth, who had been my closest friend since our undergraduate years at Williams College, embodied this shift in social dynamics. Jennifer came from a prominent family herself and had pursued a successful career in art curation while maintaining active involvement in Boston's cultural and social scene. Our friendship had been built on shared interests, similar backgrounds, and mutual support through various personal and professional challenges. The conversation that marked the end of our close friendship occurred during what was supposed to be a casual lunch at a restaurant we had frequented together for years. Jennifer had been uncharacteristically distant since news of my disinheritance had become public, and I had hoped that a private conversation would allow us to address whatever discomfort she was feeling about my situation. Instead, Jennifer used the lunch to deliver what amounted to a friendship termination notice disguised as concerned advice. She suggested that I was handling my circumstances poorly by continuing to pursue youth development work rather than focusing on rebuilding my relationship with my family and securing my financial future. "Sarah, I think you need to be realistic about your situation," Jennifer said while avoiding direct eye contact throughout most of our conversation. "You cannot continue living as though nothing has changed. Maybe this is an opportunity to reconsider your priorities and make choices that would demonstrate maturity and responsibility to your family." The advice felt like a betrayal because it reflected exactly the kind of thinking that Richard had been promoting for years. Jennifer was suggesting that I should abandon my commitment to meaningful work and instead focus on rehabilitating my image with family members who had apparently rejected my values and character. More painful than the advice itself was the clear indication that Jennifer no longer considered me a social equal whose friendship was valuable for its own sake. The shift in her demeanor and tone suggested that she viewed my reduced circumstances as somehow contagious, creating risks for her own social position that outweighed any loyalty she felt to our long-standing relationship. The pattern repeated itself with other friends and social acquaintances over the following weeks. People who had included me in their social plans and had sought my company for dinners, parties, and cultural events suddenly became unavailable or failed to extend invitations that had previously been routine. The isolation was particularly acute because it occurred during a period when I most needed emotional support and social connection. Grieving my mother's death while simultaneously dealing with the shock of apparent rejection from her estate created a level of emotional vulnerability that made social rejection especially painful and destabilizing. The psychological impact of this compound loss was more severe than I had anticipated. I found myself questioning not just my understanding of my relationship with my mother, but my judgment about human nature and social relationships more generally. If I had been so wrong about my mother's feelings toward me, and if I had been so naive about the foundation of my friendships and professional relationships, what other fundamental assumptions about my life might prove to be equally false? The self-doubt was particularly corrosive because it undermined my confidence in areas where I had previously felt secure and competent. My work with at-risk youth had always provided me with a sense of purpose and effectiveness that was independent of family wealth or social status. But even that foundation began to feel uncertain as I questioned whether my success in that field had been enabled more by financial resources than by genuine skill or dedication. During this period of isolation and self-examination, I began spending long hours alone in the guest room at the family estate, reviewing every significant conversation and interaction I had shared with my mother during her final year. I searched for signs that I had missed, indications that she was becoming disappointed with my choices or concerned about my future in ways that I had failed to recognize. The exercise was initially devastating because it forced me to consider the possibility that my perception of our relationship had been fundamentally inaccurate. Perhaps my mother had been harboring doubts about my career path and concerns about my character that she had concealed out of kindness or maternal loyalty. Perhaps Richard's version of her final wishes, while painful, reflected her honest assessment of my worthiness as an heir to the Morrison family legacy. But as I continued this careful review of our interactions, a different pattern began to emerge. While my mother had occasionally expressed concerns about my financial security and had encouraged me to develop practical skills alongside my philanthropic interests, she had never questioned the fundamental value of my work or suggested that my career choices reflected character flaws or ingratitude. More significantly, I began to remember specific conversations during her final months that seemed inconsistent with the narrative Richard had presented to our family. These conversations suggested that my mother had been making plans that assumed my continued involvement in managing Morrison family philanthropic activities and had been developing ideas for expanding charitable programs that would require my leadership and expertise. One particularly significant conversation had occurred approximately 4 months before her death, during a private dinner at her favorite restaurant in Cambridge. My mother had been unusually focused and serious that evening, discussing her concerns about ensuring that Morrison family charitable commitments would continue effectively after her death. "Sarah, I need to know that you understand the responsibility that comes with inherited wealth," she had said while carefully choosing her words. "The Morrison Family Foundation has the potential to create significant positive impact, but only if it is managed by someone who truly understands the difference between charity and justice, between helping people and empowering them to help themselves." At the time, I had interpreted this conversation as general guidance about philanthropic leadership rather than specific preparation for inheriting responsibility for family charitable activities. But reviewing it in the context of my current circumstances, I realized that my mother had been explicitly discussing my future role in managing Morrison family wealth rather than questioning my suitability for such responsibilities. This conversation, and others like it, began to create serious doubts about the authenticity of the legal documents Richard had presented to our family. If my mother had been planning for my continued involvement in family philanthropic activities just months before her death, the suggestion that she had simultaneously decided to exclude me entirely from her will seemed psychologically implausible. The growing suspicion that Richard's presentation had been misleading or fraudulent provided the first glimmer of hope I had experienced since the devastating family meeting. While I still had no concrete evidence to support my doubts, the inconsistencies between my own memories and Richard's narrative were significant enough to justify further investigation. The decision to pursue that investigation represented a crucial turning point in my response to the crisis. Instead of accepting the isolation and humiliation as inevitable consequences of my apparent rejection by my mother, I chose to take active steps to uncover the truth about her final wishes and the circumstances surrounding her estate planning. This decision required overcoming the psychological impact of weeks of social rejection and self-doubt. The investigation would necessarily involve confronting Richard directly about inconsistencies in his account, challenging the authenticity of legal documents that appeared official and legitimate, and risking further family conflict during an already difficult period of grief and adjustment. But the alternative was accepting a narrative that contradicted my deepest understanding of my mother's character and our relationship, abandoning my commitment to meaningful work in favor of attempting to rehabilitate my reputation with people who had apparently been willing to reject me based on secondhand accounts of family conflict. The choice between passive acceptance and active investigation would ultimately determine not just my understanding of my mother's final wishes, but my own character and resilience in the face of systematic manipulation and social pressure. The decision to fight for the truth, despite the risks and challenges involved, would prove to be the foundation for discoveries that would transform my understanding of my family, my community, and my own strength in ways I had never imagined possible. The investigation that began during those dark weeks of isolation would ultimately reveal not just the truth about my mother's estate planning, but the extraordinary measures she had taken to protect me from exactly the kind of manipulation and deception that Richard had been planning and implementing for years. More importantly, it would teach me that sometimes our most devastating defeats are actually preparations for victories that will prove more meaningful and transformative than anything we originally thought we wanted to achieve. The investigation into my mother's true final wishes began with methodical research that would have made my Harvard Business School professors proud. After weeks of isolation and self-doubt, I had reached a psychological breaking point where accepting Richard's narrative felt more destructive to my sense of self than risking further family conflict by challenging his version of events. The inconsistencies between my memories of conversations with my mother and the story Richard had presented were too significant to ignore, and I possessed the analytical skills necessary to conduct a thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding her estate planning. My first step was to create a comprehensive timeline of my mother's activities during her final 6 months. Using her personal calendar, credit card statements, and appointment records that I could access through her personal assistant, I began mapping her movements and meetings during the period when Richard claimed she had been reconsidering her estate plans and growing increasingly disappointed with my life choices. The calendar revealed a pattern of activities that contradicted Richard's narrative about my mother's state of mind during her final months. Far from withdrawing from philanthropic activities or expressing dissatisfaction with charitable work, she had actually increased her engagement with organizations focused on youth development and educational opportunity. She had attended board meetings, donor events, and planning sessions for initiatives that aligned closely with my own professional interests and career focus. More significantly, the calendar showed multiple appointments with professional advisors beyond her longtime attorney James Patterson. These meetings included consultations with estate planning specialists, trust administrators, and tax attorneys whose expertise suggested that my mother had been engaging in sophisticated financial planning rather than simple will modifications. The complexity and frequency of these consultations indicated that she had been implementing comprehensive protective measures rather than making emotional decisions based on disappointment with family members. The credit card statements provided additional evidence that my mother's final months had been characterized by forward-thinking planning rather than withdrawal or disappointment. She had made substantial payments to legal firms, financial advisory services, and institutional trust companies that specialized in complex estate administration. These expenses suggested systematic preparation for wealth transfer rather than reactive changes based on family conflict. Most revealing were the payments to a private investigation firm called Beacon Security Associates that had apparently been retained for several months during the period when Richard claimed my mother was losing confidence in my judgment and character. The invoices from this firm were substantial and indicated ongoing investigative work rather than a single consultation or background check. The discovery of payments to a private investigation firm represented the first concrete evidence that my mother had been taking active steps to protect herself and her assets from some perceived threat during her final months. The timing of these payments coincided with the period when Richard claimed she was growing increasingly disappointed with my career choices, suggesting that her concerns may have been focused on threats much closer to home than my professional decisions. Armed with this preliminary evidence, I scheduled a meeting with James Patterson to discuss the timeline I had constructed and to request access to any estate planning documents that his firm had prepared for my mother during her final year. Mr. Patterson had known my mother for more than 20 years and had handled legal matters for the Morrison family since before my father's divorce proceedings. The meeting took place in Mr. Patterson's office overlooking Boston Harbor, in a conference room lined with legal texts and family photographs that reflected decades of service to Boston's established families. Mr. Patterson himself was in his early 70s, with the kind of distinguished bearing and careful speech patterns that inspired confidence in his discretion and professional judgment. "Sarah, I want you to understand that I share your confusion about the circumstances surrounding your mother's estate," Mr. Patterson began after reviewing the timeline I had prepared. "The documents that Richard presented to your family are inconsistent with my understanding of your mother's intentions and completely contrary to the estate planning work we had discussed during our final meetings." This confirmation that my mother's longtime attorney had not prepared the documents Richard had distributed to our family provided the foundation for a more detailed discussion about what estate planning work had actually occurred during my mother's final months. According to Mr. Patterson, my mother had indeed engaged in substantial estate planning activities, but those activities had been focused on protecting her assets and ensuring that her true wishes would be honored rather than modifying her fundamental decisions about inheritance distribution. "Your mother was concerned about potential challenges to her estate planning from sources within the family," Mr. Patterson explained carefully, choosing his words with the precision that comes from decades of handling sensitive family matters. "She requested recommendations for additional legal counsel who could help her implement protective measures that would be difficult to contest or circumvent after her death. The protective measures my mother had implemented were more sophisticated and comprehensive than I could have imagined. Working with a team of estate planning specialists, she had created a complex trust structure that would be activated 90 days after her death, ensuring that her true wishes would be revealed and implemented regardless of any immediate challenges to her publicly filed will. This revelation transformed my understanding of the situation completely. The documents that Richard had presented to our family were apparently authentic legal documents that my mother had filed with the probate court, but they represented only one component of a more complex estate plan designed to protect her true intentions from manipulation or interference. The trust that would be activated 90 days after her death contained the majority of my mother's assets and included detailed instructions for their distribution that reflected her actual wishes, rather than the protective facade she had created through her publicly filed will. More importantly, the trust included comprehensive documentation of the circumstances that had led her to implement these protective measures, including evidence of financial manipulation and emotional abuse that she had discovered during the months before her death. Mr. Patterson explained that my mother had specifically requested that information about the trust remain confidential until its activation date, even from family members who would ultimately benefit from its provisions. She had believed that premature disclosure of the trust's existence would compromise its effectiveness as protection against the threats she had identified within the family structure. "Your mother was particularly concerned about Richard's increasing control over family financial decisions and his systematic efforts to undermine your relationship with her," Mr. Patterson continued, revealing information that validated my growing suspicions about Richard's manipulation over the years. She had documented instances of intercepted communications, deliberately misleading information about your career activities, and attempts to influence her perceptions of your character and judgment. This documentation represented evidence of manipulation that extended far beyond anything I had previously suspected. While I had begun to recognize that Richard had been influencing my mother's perceptions of my choices and priorities, I had not understood the systematic nature of his campaign to undermine our relationship or the extent to which he had been actively interfering with our communication. The discovery that my mother had not only recognized Richard's manipulation but had taken steps to document and counter it provided validation that was both emotionally healing and strategically empowering. Her decision to implement protective measures demonstrated that she had maintained faith in our relationship despite Richard's efforts to poison her perceptions of my character and choices. But the most significant revelation was yet to come. Mr. Patterson explained that my mother had not only protected her estate from Richard's manipulation, but had also gathered evidence of his financial misconduct that could potentially result in criminal charges depending on the scope and nature of his activities. Your mother discovered that Richard had been systematically diverting funds from her accounts for personal investments without her knowledge or consent, Mr. Patterson revealed, opening a file that contained bank statements, investment records, and documentation of unauthorized transactions spanning several years. The amounts involved are substantial enough to constitute felony theft, and the methods he used demonstrate sophisticated understanding of financial systems and estate planning vulnerabilities. The evidence of Richard's financial crimes was comprehensive and damning. Over a period of more than 5 years, he had diverted nearly $800,000 from my mother's various accounts into investment opportunities that he controlled directly. The transactions had been structured to avoid immediate detection, but they created a pattern of unauthorized asset transfer that would be easily recognizable to forensic accountants and financial investigators. More disturbing than the financial theft itself was the evidence that Richard had used his position as my mother's husband and financial advisor to access information and resources that enabled increasingly sophisticated criminal activity. He had obtained power of attorney authorizations under false pretenses, had misrepresented investment opportunities to justify fund transfers, and had created fraudulent documentation to cover his tracks when my mother began asking questions about account discrepancies. The discovery of this evidence transformed my understanding of Richard's motivations for manipulating my relationship with my mother. While I had initially assumed that his goal was simply to maximize his inheritance by reducing my share of the estate, the documentation revealed that he had been stealing from her for years and needed to ensure that his crimes would not be discovered and prosecuted after her death. My exclusion from my mother's will had not been motivated by disappointment with my career choices or concerns about my character. It had been part of Richard's strategy to prevent me from gaining access to financial records and legal documents that would expose his criminal activity and potentially result in his prosecution and imprisonment. The realization that my mother's supposed rejection of me had actually been her attempt to protect both of us from a criminal who had infiltrated our family was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. The emotional healing that came from understanding that our relationship had remained strong despite Richard's manipulation was offset by the recognition that I had been living with and trusting someone who was capable of sophisticated financial crimes and elaborate deception. Mr. Patterson explained that my mother had been working with law enforcement authorities during her final months to build a case against Richard that would ensure his prosecution after her death. She had been concerned that attempting to confront him directly or expose his crimes while she was still alive would put both of us at physical risk, given the amounts of money involved and the potential legal consequences he faced. The coordination with law enforcement had been handled through the private investigation firm whose invoices I had discovered in my mother's financial records. Beacon Security Associates specialized in white-collar crime investigation and had been working with federal authorities to document Richard's criminal activity and develop evidence that would support prosecution under both state and federal jurisdiction. Your mother was extraordinarily brave in her handling of this situation, Mr. Patterson observed, reviewing the documentation that detailed months of careful evidence gathering while maintaining normal family relationships with someone she knew was stealing from her. She continued to interact with Richard as though nothing had changed while systematically building the case that would ultimately expose his crimes and protect you from his manipulation. The trust that would be activated in 60 more days contained not only the majority of my mother's assets and her true wishes for their distribution, but also complete documentation of Richard's criminal activity and instructions for its delivery to law enforcement authorities. My mother had essentially created a posthumous prosecution that would ensure justice regardless of any attempts Richard might make to cover his tracks or intimidate potential witnesses after her death. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of my mother's protective measures demonstrated strategic thinking and emotional strength that I had never fully appreciated during her lifetime. While dealing with a terminal illness that she had kept secret from the family, she had simultaneously conducted a complex investigation into financial crimes, coordinated with law enforcement authorities, and implemented legal strategies that would protect both her estate and her daughter from a sophisticated criminal who had been manipulating our family for years. The discovery of this information provided immediate clarity about why Richard had been so confident during his presentation to our family and why he had seemed almost pleased to be announcing my exclusion from my mother's will. He had believed that his manipulation and theft had been successful, that my mother had died without discovering his crimes, and that his control over the publicly filed estate documents would prevent any investigation into his activities. What Richard did not know was that in 60 days, the trust activation would expose not only his lies about my mother's final wishes, but also comprehensive evidence of criminal activity that would result in his arrest and prosecution. The smug satisfaction he had displayed during the family meeting would be replaced by the terror of someone facing decades in federal prison for financial crimes committed against the woman who had trusted him with her life and her legacy. The knowledge that justice was coming provided emotional relief that was almost overwhelming after weeks of isolation and self-doubt. But more importantly, understanding the true nature of the situation empowered me to begin planning for the aftermath of the trust activation and the exposure of Richard's crimes. The next 60 days would require careful preparation for family conversations that would be even more difficult than the meeting where Richard had announced my supposed disinheritance. Family members who had accepted his narrative about my mother's disappointment would need to confront the reality that they had been manipulated by a criminal who had been stealing from our family for years. More challenging would be the process of rebuilding relationships and restoring trust with friends and professional colleagues who had distanced themselves based on false information about my character and my mother's assessment of my choices. The vindication that would come with the trust activation would provide evidence of my innocence, but it would not automatically repair the damage that had been done to relationships and reputation during the weeks of isolation and humiliation. But for the first time since my mother's death, I felt genuine hope about the future and confidence in my understanding of the past. The investigation had revealed not only the truth about my mother's final wishes, but also the extraordinary lengths she had gone to protect me from manipulation and ensure that justice would ultimately prevail over deception and criminal activity. The education I was receiving in human nature, family dynamics, and the importance of thorough investigation when facing seemingly impossible circumstances was preparing me for challenges and opportunities that I could not yet fully envision. The skills I was developing in research, analysis, and strategic thinking under pressure would prove invaluable in the transformed life that awaited me once the truth was finally revealed to everyone who had been deceived by Richard's elaborate criminal scheme. The 60 days between my discovery of the hidden trust and its scheduled activation represented a period of profound psychological transformation that would prepare me for challenges far beyond resolving my family's estate crisis. Armed with knowledge of my mother's true intentions and the evidence of Richard's criminal activities, I faced the complex task of maintaining normal family interactions while internally preparing for revelations that would fundamentally alter every relationship and assumption within our extended family network. The most immediate challenge was psychological rather than practical. After weeks of believing that my mother had rejected me and that my understanding of our relationship had been fundamentally flawed, the discovery that she had actually been protecting me from sophisticated criminal manipulation required a complete reconstruction of my emotional framework. The grief process that had been complicated by feelings of betrayal and confusion now needed to incorporate gratitude for protective measures I had never recognized and admiration for courage I had not previously understood. This psychological adjustment was complicated by the necessity of continuing to interact with Richard as though nothing had changed while possessing knowledge of his criminal activities and the prosecution that would soon result from my mother's posthumous investigation. The acting required to maintain normal family dynamics while knowing the truth about his manipulation and theft demanded emotional discipline that tested every assumption I had developed about authenticity and honest communication. The family dinners and casual conversations that had always been routine aspects of life at the Morrison estate became exercises in strategic communication and careful observation. I found myself analyzing Richard's words and behavior for signs of the manipulative patterns my mother had documented, while simultaneously working to ensure that my own responses did not reveal my knowledge of the approaching trust activation and criminal exposure. These interactions provided an education in human psychology and behavioral analysis that no academic program could have offered. Watching Richard navigate family conversations while believing that his deception had been successful revealed the confidence and calculated charm that had enabled his manipulation for more than a decade. His ability to project concern, authority, and family loyalty while systematically stealing and lying demonstrated the sophisticated skill set that characterizes successful white-collar criminals. More disturbing was observing how family members continued to respond positively to Richard's leadership and guidance even after the devastating announcement of my supposed disinheritance. My stepbrother Marcus and stepsister Victoria appeared to accept their father's narrative about my mother's disappointment without questioning the psychological plausibility of such a dramatic change in her assessment of my character and choices. The extended family members who had attended the original meeting continued to treat Richard with respect and deference while maintaining distance from me that suggested they considered my reduced circumstances potentially embarrassing or socially problematic. These ongoing dynamics reinforced my understanding of how effectively Richard had positioned himself as the reliable family leader while portraying me as the disappointing and ungrateful outlier. The social isolation that had characterized the previous weeks continued during this period, but my psychological response to rejection and distance was completely transformed by knowledge of the truth. Instead of interpreting social avoidance as confirmation of my supposed failings, I began to understand these reactions as evidence of how effectively sophisticated manipulation can influence perceptions and damage relationships even among intelligent and well-intentioned people. This reframing of my social circumstances created opportunities for personal growth and skill development that would prove invaluable in my future career and relationships. Rather than spending emotional energy on defending myself against false accusations or attempting to rehabilitate my reputation based on incomplete information, I focused on developing the analytical and strategic thinking abilities that would enable me to navigate complex situations with confidence and effectiveness. The investigation skills I had developed while researching my mother's true estate planning activities proved applicable to understanding the broader patterns of manipulation that had characterized my family dynamics for years. I began to recognize specific techniques Richard had used to isolate me from my mother, undermine our communication, and position himself as the primary source of information and guidance for family decisions. The systematic nature of his manipulation was revealed through careful analysis of family interactions over several years. Richard had consistently positioned himself as the reasonable mediator between my mother and me whenever disagreements or tensions arose, ensuring that direct communication was filtered through his perspectives and interpretations. He had regularly shared selective information about my activities and choices with my mother while simultaneously providing me with carefully edited versions of her responses and concerns. Most significantly, I began to understand how Richard had exploited my mother's genuine love for me and her natural parental concerns about my future security and happiness. By framing his manipulation as protection of both my mother and me from potential disappointment or conflict, he had made his interference appear beneficial rather than controlling, making it extremely difficult to recognize or resist. This analysis provided insight into manipulation techniques that extended far beyond family dynamics to professional and social relationships. The education I was receiving in recognizing and responding to psychological manipulation would prove essential for leadership roles that would require me to identify and counter similar tactics in business, nonprofit, and community settings. During this period of forced observation and analysis, I also began developing strategic communication skills that would become crucial for my future success. The necessity of maintaining normal family relationships while possessing explosive knowledge about criminal activities required me to become extraordinarily careful and deliberate in my word choices, emotional expressions, and behavioral responses. These circumstances provided intensive training in emotional regulation under pressure, strategic thinking about complex interpersonal dynamics, and the ability to maintain long-term perspective while managing immediate challenges. The skills I was developing through this demanding situation would prove essential for leadership positions that would require managing sensitive information, navigating organizational politics, and maintaining composure during crisis situations. The professional implications of my changed circumstances also began to create unexpected opportunities for growth and development. While the immediate impact of my supposed disinheritance had been socially and professionally isolating, the extended period of reduced external demands allowed me to focus on skill development and strategic planning that had been impossible during my previous busy schedule of volunteer commitments and social obligations. The youth mentorship program that had been canceled due to funding concerns became the subject of intensive redesign and strategic planning that would ultimately result in a more effective and sustainable approach to serving at-risk teenagers. Without the pressure of implementing an ambitious program immediately, I was able to conduct thorough research into best practices, develop partnerships with other organizations, and create operational frameworks that would prove more successful than my original plans. This research and planning work revealed that my previous approach to program development had been limited by assumptions about funding and organizational structure that were based more on traditional philanthropic models than on innovative approaches to social problem solving. The forced pause in my professional activities created opportunities to explore alternative methodologies and partnership structures that would ultimately prove more effective and sustainable. The isolation from traditional philanthropic networks also forced me to develop direct relationships with the young people and families who would be served by mentorship programs rather than relying primarily on institutional perspectives and secondhand information about community needs. These direct relationships provided insights into challenges and opportunities that had been invisible from my previous position within established charitable organizations. The teenagers I met during informal community work were dealing with complexities that required more sophisticated and flexible support than traditional mentorship programs typically provided. Housing instability, family dysfunction, educational gaps, and employment challenges were interconnected in ways that demanded comprehensive rather than segmented approaches to intervention and support. Understanding these interconnected challenges required developing systems thinking and strategic analysis skills that complemented the research and investigation abilities I was developing through my family situation. The combination of personal crisis management and professional development was creating a comprehensive skill set that would enable me to approach complex problems with analytical rigor and practical effectiveness. The financial constraints that resulted from my supposed disinheritance also provided valuable education in resource management and creative problem solving that I had never needed to develop during my privileged upbringing. Learning to live within limited means while maintaining professional effectiveness required developing efficiency and prioritization skills that would prove essential for future entrepreneurial activities. More importantly, the experience of financial limitation provided emotional and psychological perspective on the challenges faced by the young people I hoped to serve through mentorship programs. The stress and uncertainty that accompanied reduced circumstances created empathy and understanding that enhanced my ability to provide meaningful support to others facing similar challenges. The combination of personal crisis, professional uncertainty, and social isolation was creating a comprehensive education in resilience, strategic thinking, and human nature that no traditional career path could have provided. While the circumstances were often uncomfortable and sometimes painful, the skills and perspectives I was developing would prove invaluable for leadership roles that would require managing complex challenges with limited resources and uncertain outcomes. As the trust activation date approached, I began preparing for conversations and decisions that would extend far beyond resolving my family's estate disputes. The evidence of Richard's criminal activities would require coordination with law enforcement authorities, communication with family members who had been deceived, and strategic planning for protecting and rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by systematic manipulation. The revelation of my mother's true wishes would restore my access to family financial resources, but more importantly, it would provide validation of her love and confidence in my character and choices. This validation would create opportunities and responsibilities that would require all the skills and perspectives I had been developing during the months of crisis and uncertainty. The youth mentorship programs I had been redesigning would become feasible not just through restored funding, but through enhanced understanding of community needs and more sophisticated approaches to program development and implementation. The investigation and analytical skills I had developed would enable me to create more effective and sustainable interventions that addressed root causes rather than surface symptoms of youth development challenges. The leadership abilities I was developing through managing complex family dynamics and criminal investigations would prepare me for roles in organizational management and social change initiatives that would extend far beyond traditional philanthropic activities. The combination of analytical skills, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking would enable me to create comprehensive solutions to complex social problems. Most significantly, the experience of discovering truth through systematic investigation and maintaining integrity despite social pressure and personal cost was building confidence in my ability to navigate challenging circumstances and achieve just outcomes even when facing sophisticated opposition. This confidence would prove essential for leadership roles that would require challenging established systems and advocating for fundamental changes in how communities address youth development and social justice issues. The approaching trust activation represented not just the resolution of a family crisis, but the beginning of opportunities to apply everything I had learned during months of forced growth and development. The skills and perspectives I had gained would enable me to pursue meaningful work with enhanced effectiveness and expanded impact, creating positive change that would extend far beyond my personal circumstances to benefit countless young people and families who needed exactly the kind of comprehensive support I was now equipped to provide. The transformation from isolated family outcast to strategic investigator required developing relationships and alliances that would prove essential, both for navigating the immediate crisis and for building the foundation of my future career in social justice advocacy. The weeks leading up to the trust activation provided unexpected opportunities to connect with individuals whose expertise, perspective, and support would become instrumental in exposing Richard's criminal activities and implementing my mother's true vision for the Morrison family legacy. The first of these crucial relationships emerged from my continued work with at-risk youth in Boston's underserved communities. Despite the cancellation of the formal mentorship program that had been planned through Urban Futures, I maintained informal contact with several teenagers who had been identified as potential participants in the initiative. These young people were navigating complex challenges that required exactly the kind of comprehensive support that traditional social service agencies struggled to provide effectively. Among these young people was Marcus Williams, an 18-year-old, who was aging out of the foster care system while attempting to complete his high school education and secure stable housing. Marcus possessed exceptional intelligence and leadership potential, but he faced systemic barriers that made conventional pathways to success nearly impossible despite his determination and capabilities. Marcus had been placed in foster care at age 12 after his mother's death from cancer and his father's subsequent incarceration for drug-related offenses. He had experienced placement in 7 different foster homes during his 6 years in the system, disrupting his education and preventing the formation of stable supportive relationships that most young people take for granted during their developmental years. Despite these extraordinary challenges, Marcus had maintained excellent academic performance and had developed sophisticated understanding of social systems and institutional dynamics that rivaled graduate-level coursework in sociology and public policy. His insights into the gaps and failures of existing support systems provided education that no traditional research methodology could have offered. The conversations I shared with Marcus during this period revealed the limitations of my previous approach to youth development work and inspired more comprehensive strategies for addressing the interconnected challenges that affect vulnerable young people. Marcus demonstrated that effective mentorship required understanding not just individual motivation and skill development, but also the systemic barriers that prevented talented young people from accessing opportunities that would enable them to achieve their potential. Marcus introduced me to other young people in similar circumstances, creating an informal network of individuals who were successfully navigating complex challenges through mutual support and shared resources. This network operated with remarkable efficiency and effectiveness, providing practical assistance, emotional support, and strategic guidance that supplemented inadequate formal services. The young people in this network had developed survival skills and problem-solving abilities that demonstrated resilience and intelligence under pressure. Their approaches to managing crisis situations, building supportive relationships, and maintaining focus on long-term goals despite immediate obstacles provided models for leadership development that I had never encountered in traditional educational or professional settings. Working directly with these young people rather than through institutional intermediaries revealed the gap between theoretical knowledge about youth development and practical understanding of the challenges and opportunities that determined actual outcomes for vulnerable populations. This direct engagement would ultimately inform more effective approaches to program design and implementation that addressed real needs rather than institutional assumptions about appropriate interventions. The second crucial relationship that developed during this period was with Detective Rebecca Santos of the Boston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Santos had been assigned to coordinate with the federal investigators who were building the case against Richard based on evidence my mother had provided through Beacon Security Associates. Detective Santos contacted me approximately 3 weeks before the scheduled trust activation to discuss my potential role as a witness in the criminal prosecution that would follow the revelation of Richard's financial crimes. This conversation provided the first official confirmation that law enforcement authorities were indeed prepared to act on the evidence my mother had gathered during her final months. Detective Santos was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who specialized in white-collar crime investigations involving family trusts, estate fraud, and financial elder abuse. Her expertise in these areas had been developed through handling cases that revealed patterns of manipulation and theft similar to what Richard had perpetrated against my mother and our family. The detective's approach to discussing the case was both professional and compassionate, recognizing that my situation involved not just criminal victimization but also complex family dynamics and emotional trauma that would require careful handling throughout the legal proceedings. Her guidance helped me understand the process that would unfold after the trust activation and prepared me for the challenging conversations and decisions that would be required. Detective Santos explained that Richard's criminal activities represented sophisticated financial fraud that extended beyond simple theft to include identity manipulation, document forgery, and systematic abuse of fiduciary responsibilities. The evidence my mother had gathered would support prosecution under multiple federal and state statutes that carried significant penalties, including substantial prison sentences and complete restitution of stolen assets. The detective's description of the investigation process revealed the extraordinary thoroughness and courage that my mother had demonstrated during her final months. Working with private investigators and law enforcement professionals, she had documented not just individual transactions but entire patterns of criminal behavior that would enable prosecutors to demonstrate the systematic nature of Richard's fraud and the sophisticated planning that had enabled his theft. This information provided deeper appreciation for my mother's strategic thinking and emotional strength during the period when she was simultaneously managing her terminal illness, maintaining normal family relationships with someone she knew was stealing from her, and coordinating with law enforcement authorities to ensure that justice would be achieved after her death. Detective Santos also helped me understand the broader implications of the case for other families who might be vulnerable to similar financial manipulation by trusted family members or advisors. The patterns that Richard had used were common among white-collar criminals who targeted wealthy families, particularly those with elderly or ill family members who might be unable to effectively monitor complex financial activities. The third significant relationship that developed during this period was with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who specialized in family manipulation cases and had been retained by the law enforcement team to analyze the psychological dynamics that had enabled Richard's criminal activities to continue undetected for such an extended period. Dr. Rodriguez contacted me to discuss my observations of Richard's behavior and my experience of his manipulation techniques throughout the years of his marriage to my mother. These conversations provided professional validation of my growing understanding of how sophisticated psychological manipulation operates within family systems and how intelligent, well-educated people can be systematically deceived by individuals who understand their vulnerabilities and motivations. Dr. Rodriguez explained that Richard's approach to manipulation demonstrated characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder combined with exceptional intelligence and strategic thinking abilities. His ability to maintain different personas for different family members while systematically undermining relationships and trust represented sophisticated psychological manipulation that was particularly difficult to recognize or resist. The psychologist's analysis helped me understand that my initial failure to recognize the extent of Richard's manipulation was not evidence of personal weakness or poor judgment, but rather a normal response to deliberately constructed deception by someone with advanced skills in psychological manipulation. This understanding was crucial for rebuilding confidence in my own perceptions and decision-making abilities. Dr. Rodriguez also provided insight into the long-term psychological effects of sustained manipulation and helped me develop strategies for healing from years of systematic gaslighting and relationship undermining. Her guidance would prove essential for rebuilding authentic relationships with family members who had also been deceived and for developing the emotional resilience necessary for effective leadership in challenging circumstances. The conversations with Dr. Rodriguez revealed that my experience with Richard's manipulation had inadvertently provided intensive education in recognizing and responding to psychological manipulation techniques that would prove valuable in professional and community leadership roles. Understanding how manipulation operates in family systems provided transferable knowledge for identifying and countering similar tactics in organizational and social settings. The fourth crucial relationship that emerged during this period was with Maria Santos, the restaurant owner who had employed me during my brief experience with service work before pursuing my MBA. Maria had continued to operate her restaurant despite ongoing challenges with financial management and strategic planning that limited her ability to expand her successful business model. My renewed contact with Maria began when I sought a quiet location for private phone conversations with law enforcement authorities and legal advisors who were coordinating the trust activation and criminal prosecution. Maria's restaurant provided a discreet meeting space where I could discuss sensitive matters without risk of family members overhearing conversations that might compromise the investigation. Maria recognized that I was dealing with significant personal challenges and offered both practical support and emotional encouragement during what she understood to be a difficult family situation. Her perspective as a small business owner who had built success through determination despite limited resources provided inspiration and practical guidance for managing uncertainty and stress during crisis periods. The conversations with Maria also renewed my interest in applying analytical and strategic thinking skills to help small business owners overcome specific challenges that limited their growth and success. Maria's restaurant had the potential for significant expansion, but she lacked access to the kind of strategic planning and financial analysis that could enable systematic growth rather than survival-focused operations. Working with Maria on business development strategies provided practical application for the research and analytical skills I had been developing through my investigation into family estate matters. The process of analyzing her business operations, identifying growth opportunities, and developing implementation strategies created a bridge between academic knowledge and real-world problem-solving that would prove essential for my future career. Maria's business challenges were representative of obstacles faced by many small business owners who possessed operational expertise and customer loyalty but lacked access to strategic planning and financial management resources that larger organizations could afford. The opportunity to help Maria address these challenges provided insight into market needs that would eventually inform broader business consulting strategies. The fifth significant relationship that developed during this period was with Father Thomas McCarthy, the priest who had officiated at my mother's funeral and who had provided spiritual guidance to our family during previous crisis periods. Father McCarthy had known my mother for more than 15 years and had observed the changes in family dynamics that had occurred following Richard's marriage and increasing influence over family decisions. Father McCarthy contacted me several weeks before the trust activation to express concern about the isolation I had experienced following the announcement of my supposed disinheritance. His outreach was motivated by pastoral care rather than curiosity about family business, but his perspective on family relationships and ethical behavior provided valuable guidance for navigating the complex moral and emotional challenges that would arise when Richard's criminal activities were exposed. The conversations with Father McCarthy helped me understand the spiritual dimensions of forgiveness, justice, and family reconciliation that would be necessary for healing relationships that had been damaged by years of manipulation and deception. His guidance emphasized the importance of pursuing justice while maintaining compassion for family members who had also been victims of Richard's sophisticated manipulation. Father McCarthy also provided historical context about the Morrison family's values and charitable commitments that helped me understand my mother's vision for using inherited wealth to create positive social impact. His knowledge of previous generations' philanthropic activities informed my understanding of the legacy I would inherit and the responsibilities that would accompany restored access to family resources. The priest's perspective on ethical leadership and social responsibility would prove influential in shaping my approach to implementing my mother's true wishes for charitable giving and community impact. His emphasis on service to others and commitment to justice provided spiritual foundation for the expanded social justice work that would become possible through resolution of the estate crisis. These strategic relationships formed the foundation for both immediate crisis management and long-term career development that would enable me to pursue meaningful work with enhanced effectiveness and expanded impact. The combination of direct experience with vulnerable youth, professional law enforcement expertise, psychological insight into manipulation dynamics, small business development knowledge, and spiritual guidance created comprehensive preparation for leadership roles that would require managing complex challenges while maintaining ethical standards and authentic relationships. The trust activation that was approaching would resolve the immediate crisis of my supposed disinheritance and expose Richard's criminal activities, but the relationships and skills I had developed during the preceding months would enable me to use the restored opportunities and resources to create positive change that extended far beyond personal vindication to meaningful impact for communities and individuals who needed exactly the kind of comprehensive support I was now equipped to provide. The final weeks before the trust activation brought unexpected opportunities to build connections that would transform my understanding of community organizing, social justice advocacy, and the practical mechanisms through which meaningful change occurs in complex social systems. The relationships I had been developing with individuals across different sectors of Boston's community began to reveal patterns of interconnected challenges and collaborative solutions that would fundamentally reshape my approach to philanthropic work and social impact initiatives. The expansion of my professional network during this period occurred through a combination of deliberate outreach and fortuitous encounters that demonstrated how authentic engagement with community needs can rapidly generate opportunities for meaningful collaboration. The young people I had been working with informally, the law enforcement professionals coordinating Richard's prosecution, and the community leaders I had encountered through various volunteer activities began introducing me to other individuals whose expertise and perspectives would prove essential for implementing comprehensive approaches to social justice work. Marcus Williams, the 18-year-old who was aging out of foster care while completing his high school education, proved particularly instrumental in connecting me with other young adults who had successfully navigated similar challenges and were now working to create support systems for others facing comparable obstacles. Marcus had maintained informal relationships with former foster care residents who had managed to achieve stability despite systemic barriers, and he arranged for me to meet several of these individuals who had developed innovative approaches to mutual assistance and community building. The first of these meetings occurred at a community center in Roxbury, where I was introduced to a group of young adults who had organized themselves into what they called the Independent Living Collective. This organization operated as an informal support network that provided practical assistance, emotional encouragement, and strategic guidance for young people transitioning out of institutional care systems. The Independent Living Collective had been founded by Jasmine Washington, a 23-year-old who had aged out of foster care 5 years earlier and had subsequently completed community college while working multiple part-time jobs to maintain stable housing. Jasmine possessed exceptional organizational skills and had developed systematic approaches to helping other young adults navigate the complex processes involved in securing housing, employment, education, and healthcare without family support systems. The meeting with Jasmine and her colleagues provided profound education about community organizing principles and grassroots leadership development that complemented the more formal training I had received through academic programs and professional development opportunities. The Independent Living Collective demonstrated how effective mutual aid organizations could be created and sustained through collaborative leadership rather than traditional hierarchical management structures. Jasmine explained that the collective operated according to principles of shared responsibility and democratic decision-making that ensured all members had meaningful input into programs and priorities. This approach had proven more effective than traditional social service delivery models because it recognized the expertise and agency of the young people being served rather than treating them as passive recipients of assistance designed by external professionals. The collective provided concrete support including temporary housing assistance, job placement coordination, educational guidance, and emergency financial help, but these services were embedded within a broader framework of community building and leadership development that empowered members to become resources for others facing similar challenges. This model created sustainable support networks that continued to expand and strengthen over time rather than requiring ongoing external funding and professional staffing. Working with the Independent Living Collective provided practical education in community organizing techniques, resource development strategies, and collaborative leadership approaches that would prove essential for implementing more effective youth development programs. The experience also demonstrated how traditional philanthropic models often failed to recognize and support the most innovative and effective community-based initiatives because they operated outside conventional organizational structures. The second significant expansion of my network occurred through connections with legal professionals who specialized in civil rights advocacy and had been monitoring Richard's criminal case because of its implications for elder abuse prevention and family financial protection. Attorney Patricia Chen from the Massachusetts Legal Aid Society contacted me to discuss the potential for using my family's case as the foundation for broader advocacy initiatives focused on protecting vulnerable adults from financial manipulation by trusted family members. Attorney Chen had extensive experience with cases involving financial abuse of elderly individuals and had recognized that the sophisticated nature of Richard's criminal activities represented patterns that affected many families but were rarely prosecuted successfully due to the complexity of gathering evidence and the reluctance of family members to pursue criminal charges against relatives. The documentation my mother had provided through her collaboration with law enforcement authorities represented an exceptionally comprehensive collection of evidence that could establish legal precedents and inform policy development for protecting other families from similar manipulation and theft. Attorney Chen proposed coordinating with my legal team to ensure that Richard's prosecution would generate maximum educational value for legal professionals and policymakers working on elder abuse prevention. This collaboration with civil rights advocates provided insight into systemic approaches to social justice work that extended beyond individual case resolution to institutional change and policy development. The experience of working with Attorney Chen would prove formative in developing my understanding of how personal experiences with injustice could be transformed into broader advocacy initiatives that created lasting positive change for entire communities. The third expansion of my network resulted from continued collaboration with Detective Santos and her colleagues in law enforcement who were coordinating with federal investigators on Richard's case. Detective Santos introduced me to other professionals who specialized in white-collar crime prevention and had been developing educational programs for financial institutions, legal professionals, and community organizations focused on identifying and preventing family financial abuse. These law enforcement professionals were particularly interested in my perspective as a family member who had experienced sophisticated psychological manipulation over an extended period without recognizing the criminal activities that were occurring simultaneously. My insights into how intelligent, well-educated individuals could be systematically deceived provided valuable information for developing more effective prevention programs and victim support services. The collaboration with law enforcement professionals also provided education about investigative techniques and evidence analysis that would prove valuable for future work in social justice advocacy and community organizing. Understanding how systematic documentation and strategic coordination could expose complex criminal activities informed my approach to addressing other forms of institutional dysfunction and abuse within social service systems. The fourth significant network expansion occurred through my renewed collaboration with Maria Santos and her restaurant business, which had attracted attention from other small business owners who were interested in the strategic planning and financial analysis approaches I had been developing through my work with her establishment. Maria had begun sharing information about the business development strategies we had implemented, and several other restaurant and retail business owners had expressed interest in similar consultation services. This informal consulting work provided practical application for analytical and strategic thinking skills while generating income that reduced my dependence on family financial resources during the period before the trust activation. More importantly, the work revealed significant market demand for accessible business consulting services that could help small businesses overcome growth obstacles and achieve greater stability and profitability. The small business owners I worked with during this period faced similar challenges related to cash flow management, marketing strategy, operational efficiency, and expansion planning, but they lacked access to professional consulting services because of cost barriers and cultural factors that made traditional business advisory relationships uncomfortable or impractical. Developing effective approaches to small business consulting required understanding not just analytical techniques and strategic frameworks, but also cultural dynamics, communication preferences, and resource constraints that affected how advice could be delivered and implemented successfully. This work provided comprehensive education in practical consulting skills that would prove essential for future entrepreneurial activities. The fifth expansion of my network resulted from conversations with Father McCarthy, who introduced me to other religious and community leaders who were working on social justice initiatives throughout Boston's diverse neighborhoods. These introductions provided access to established networks of community organizers, advocacy groups, and grassroots organizations that had been addressing systemic inequality and injustice for decades. Father McCarthy arranged for me to attend several interfaith coalition meetings where religious leaders from different traditions collaborated on initiatives related to housing justice, educational equity, criminal justice reform, and economic development. These meetings provided education about coalition building techniques, policy advocacy strategies, and the complex relationships between religious institutions and secular social justice organizations. The interfaith coalition work also demonstrated how effective advocacy required understanding and respecting different cultural approaches to social change while building consensus around shared values and common objectives. This experience would prove invaluable for future work that required building coalitions across different communities and organizations with varying perspectives and priorities. The religious and community leaders I met through Father McCarthy also provided historical context about previous social justice initiatives in Boston and insights into the long-term persistence and strategic flexibility required for achieving meaningful institutional change. Their experience with sustained advocacy campaigns informed my understanding of how individual crises and opportunities could be integrated into broader movements for systemic transformation. The sixth expansion of my network occurred through continued work with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the forensic psychologist who had been analyzing the psychological dynamics of Richard's manipulation tactics. Dr. Rodriguez introduced me to other mental health professionals who specialized in trauma recovery and had been developing innovative approaches to helping individuals heal from systematic manipulation and psychological abuse. These mental health professionals were particularly interested in my experience of maintaining psychological resilience and analytical clarity while being subjected to sophisticated manipulation over an extended period. My insights into protective factors and coping strategies provided information that could enhance therapeutic approaches for other individuals recovering from similar experiences. The collaboration with mental health professionals also provided education about trauma-informed approaches to social service delivery and community organizing that would prove essential for working effectively with vulnerable populations who had experienced various forms of abuse, neglect, and systemic discrimination. Understanding how trauma affects individual psychology and community dynamics informed more effective strategies for building trust, facilitating participation, and supporting empowerment among individuals and communities that had been systematically marginalized or exploited by existing institutional structures. The comprehensive network of relationships I had developed during the months preceding the trust activation represented far more than professional connections or strategic alliances. These relationships provided access to diverse perspectives, specialized expertise, and collaborative opportunities that would enable me to pursue social justice work with enhanced effectiveness and expanded impact. The young adults I had met through foster care advocacy brought authentic understanding of community needs and grassroots organizing principles. The legal professionals provided expertise in policy development and systemic advocacy approaches. The law enforcement specialists offered insights into investigation techniques and prevention strategies. The small business owners created opportunities for economic development and entrepreneurial skill building. The religious and community leaders contributed historical perspective and coalition building experience. The mental health professionals provided trauma-informed approaches and healing-focused methodologies. The integration of these diverse perspectives and areas of expertise would prove essential for implementing comprehensive approaches to social justice work that addressed both immediate needs and systemic barriers while supporting individual empowerment and community development. The trust activation that was approaching would provide financial resources and legal vindication, but the relationships and collaborative opportunities one had developed would enable me to use those resources to create meaningful and lasting positive change for communities and individuals who needed exactly the kind of comprehensive support that traditional philanthropic approaches had failed to provide effectively. The education I had received through building this network of relationships during a period of personal crisis had prepared me for leadership roles that would require managing complex challenges while maintaining authentic connections with diverse communities and organizations. The approaching trust activation would mark the beginning of opportunities to apply everything I had learned during months of strategic relationship building and skill development, transforming personal vindication into community empowerment and social justice advancement. The transformation from isolated family outcast to strategic community leader required developing systematic approaches to project management and organizational development that would enable me to leverage the approaching trust activation effectively. The final month before the scheduled revelation of my mother's true wishes provided intensive education in strategic planning methodologies and resource development techniques that would prove essential for implementing comprehensive social justice initiatives with lasting community impact. The first systematic preparation initiative involved creating detailed operational frameworks for the youth mentorship programs I had been redesigning during months of professional isolation. Working with Marcus Williams and the Independent Living Collective, I developed comprehensive program models that integrated direct service delivery with community organizing principles and leadership development strategies that would empower participants to become advocates for systemic change rather than simply recipients of charitable assistance. The program design process required synthesizing insights from diverse sources including academic research on youth development theory, practical knowledge gained through direct engagement with young adults navigating complex challenges, and strategic guidance from experienced community organizers who understood the political and economic factors that perpetuated systemic inequality. This integration of theoretical knowledge with practical experience created program models that addressed both immediate needs and underlying structural barriers that limited opportunities for vulnerable youth populations. The comprehensive program framework included multiple interconnected components designed to provide holistic support for young adults transitioning from institutional care systems to independent living. Individual mentoring relationships would be embedded within peer support networks that fostered mutual assistance and collective problem solving. Educational support would include both academic skill development and critical thinking training that enabled participants to analyze and challenge systems that perpetuated their marginalization. Employment preparation would extend beyond traditional job training to include entrepreneurship development and cooperative business formation that could create sustainable economic opportunities within participant communities. Housing assistance would incorporate advocacy training that empowered participants to organize for policy changes that addressed affordable housing shortages and discriminatory practices that affected vulnerable populations disproportionately. The most innovative aspect of the program design was its emphasis on leadership development that prepared participants to become advocates and organizers who could create positive change for others facing similar challenges. This approach recognized that sustainable solutions to complex social problems required empowering affected communities to lead transformation efforts rather than relying exclusively on external professional interventions. Creating detailed operational plans for these comprehensive programs required developing project management skills and strategic planning capabilities that complemented the analytical and research abilities I had been strengthening throughout the crisis period. The discipline of translating vision into actionable implementation strategies provided practical education in organizational development that would prove essential for future leadership roles. The second systematic preparation initiative involved establishing formal consulting relationships with small business owners who had been requesting strategic planning assistance based on the work I had been conducting with Maria Santos and her restaurant. The demand for accessible business consulting services had grown consistently as word spread about the analytical approaches and strategic frameworks I had developed for addressing common challenges faced by immigrant entrepreneurs and family-owned businesses. Formalizing these consulting relationships required developing standardized service delivery models that could be replicated across different business contexts while maintaining the personal attention and cultural sensitivity that had made the informal work effective. This process involved creating assessment tools, planning frameworks, and implementation support systems that could help business owners achieve sustainable growth while preserving the values and community connections that motivated their entrepreneurial activities. The consulting work provided practical application for strategic thinking skills while generating income that would enable me to maintain financial independence regardless of the outcome of the trust activation. More importantly, the experience of helping small businesses overcome growth obstacles demonstrated how analytical capabilities could be applied to create immediate positive impact for individuals and families who were building economic stability through entrepreneurship and community-focused business development. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.